Today on RoxomTV News, the U.S. quietly lifts sanctions on Russian oil as Wall Street has its worst day of 2026 after Iran hints it might keep the Strait of Hormuz closed, and investors are reminded that the global economy still runs on oil moving through a shipping lane barely wider than Manhattan. The Senate passes a bill banning large investors from buying more single-family homes, which means Wall Street may soon have to find a new hobby besides becoming everyone's landlord. In Italy, prosecutors are trying to put Amazon on criminal trial over more than $1 billion in alleged tax evasions because apparently even big tech occasionally gets a letter from the tax office. And Strategy raises enough money in a single week to potentially buy over 10,000 Bitcoin, which suggests that financial markets are slowly inventing new ways to turn investor demand into Bitcoin accumulation. I'm your host, Hank Hudson. Bitcoin is currently trading around $72,000, and that brings us to our top story of the morning. The Trump administration recently lifted certain sanctions on Russian oil, not as a favor, but as an emergency attempt to keep global energy prices from spiraling even higher during widening Middle East conflict. The Treasury Department issued a 30-day waiver allowing countries to purchase Russian crude that is already stranded at sea, which currently amounts to roughly 124 million barrels floating around global shipping lanes looking for a buyer. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called the move narrowly tailored and insisted it would not provide significant financial benefit to the Russian government. Russia, somewhat unsurprisingly, disagrees. Kremlin envoy Kirill Dmitriev posted on X, and I'll quote it exactly. He said, "Buy Russian oil and gas to maintain a balanced energy supply." European leaders are furious, arguing that sanctions were originally designed to punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, not to be relaxed during another geopolitical crisis.
Unfortunately, Russia continues to show no willingness to negotiate. We will and we must therefore have to increase the pressure on Moscow. I want to make this very clear. Easing sanctions now, for whatever reason, is something we believe is wrong. We will continue our support for Ukraine. We will not be deterred or distracted from this by the war in Iran.
Now, analysts estimate that Russia could earn around $150 million per day in additional oil revenue during the waiver period, which raises the awkward geopolitical question hovering over all of this. When energy markets start panicking, sanctions can suddenly become a lot more flexible. And for those of you tuning in at home, this matters because oil prices literally ripple through everything. Gas stations to airline tickets to inflation, meaning that decisions made in Washington and Moscow often show up a few days later on your credit card statement. A Pentagon investigation has reached a deeply troubling conclusion as the U.S. military likely struck an all-girls school during a recent missile attack. The weapon involved was a Tomahawk cruise missile, which matters because Tomahawks are currently operated only by the United States in this conflict. According to the preliminary investigation, the missile was targeting an Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval base. Newly geolocated footage shows the missile hitting the compound. Take a look.
This is the moment a missile slammed into an Iranian base in Minab, a city in southern Iran, just over a week ago. In this freeze frame, you can see it clearly. Weapons experts tell CNN the wings and tail are consistent with a Tomahawk missile. This new video is the clearest evidence yet that suggests it was the United States that struck an elementary school next to that Revolutionary Guards base, killing scores of students.
The school reportedly had 264 girls between the ages of 7 and 12 inside when the strike occurred. At least 165 children and teachers were killed. President Trump blamed Iran, saying they're very inaccurate with their munitions and suggesting that Iran might also possess Tomahawk missiles, although no other military in this conflict operates them. Separate reporting from PBS indicates recent Pentagon budget cuts significantly reduced the Department of Defense's Civilian Protection Office. And for those of you tuning in from home, this story matters because incidents like this can dramatically escalate conflicts, shift global opinions, and complicate military strategy, especially when the world is already watching tensions in the region rise by the day. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, financial markets had their worst day of 2026 after a single statement out of Iran rattled investors across the entire global economy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 739 points, while the S&P 5 fell 1.52%, and the Nasdaq slid 1.78%. The catalyst came from Mojtaba Khamenei, who suggested the Strait of Hormuz could remain closed as a tool to pressure the enemy. That narrow shipping lane handles roughly 20% of the world's oil supply, so when someone even hints at shutting it down, markets tend to react with the emotional stability of a caffeinated squirrel. Now, efforts to calm investors didn't exactly work. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels of reserves, and the United States added another 172 million barrels from its strategic petroleum reserve. Yet oil prices kept on climbing. Bloomberg Economics estimates that a 3-month Hormuz closure could send crude prices to $164 per barrel. Before the conflict escalated, Brent crude had been comfortably trading between $60 and $70 per barrel. It recently closed near 100, and markets are now adjusting everything from airline stocks to inflation forecasts to expectations for Federal Reserve interest rate cuts as a result. So for those of you tuning in at home, this is a big deal because when oil spikes, it doesn't just stay in the energy sector. It makes its way into all different parts of your everyday life and ultimately increases the cost of your ability to live. So it's a big deal. Moving on, also in Washington, D.C., the Senate recently passed one of the most aggressive housing bills in decades. And this time, the target is large investors buying up single-family homes. The legislation bars any investor who already owns 350 or more houses from purchasing additional single-family properties. Companies that build or renovate homes can still own them, but they must sell the properties within 7 years rather than holding them indefinitely as rental portfolios. The push came from President Trump, who reportedly refused to sign the broader housing bill without restrictions included. Now, in a rare moment of bipartisan harmony, never thought I'd say that again, the measure was co-sponsored by Senator Tim Scott and Senator Elizabeth Warren, which is the legislative equivalent of seeing two rival sports teams suddenly sharing the same locker room. The bill also includes more than 40 provisions aimed at increasing housing supply, including faster environmental reviews, pre-approved home designs, and raising the bank investment cap for affordable housing from 15 to 20%. You see, the U.S. currently faces a housing shortage estimated at 4 million homes, while the median home price has climbed roughly $400,000, far beyond what many families can afford. Now, critics argue the cap could damage the growing build-to-rent housing market, with Senator Brian Schatz calling the restriction bananas. The bill now heads back to the House for reconciliation. Over in Italy, prosecutors are attempting something that would have sounded almost impossible a decade ago, putting one of the world's biggest tech companies on criminal trial. You see, Italian authorities have asked a judge to move forward with a case accusing Amazon's European unit and 4 company executives of helping facilitate roughly 1.2 billion pounds, or about $1.3 billion, in unpaid value-added taxes tied to online sales between 2019 and 2021. Investigators say that Amazon's marketplace allowed thousands of third-party sellers, many based outside the European Union and frequently operating out of China, to sell products to Italian customers without properly collecting or paying the required VAT taxes. Now, under Italy's digital marketplace rules, platforms that host those transactions can potentially be held responsible. Amazon has already paid around 527 million euro to settle a related dispute with Italy's tax authority. But prosecutors are arguing that financial settlements do not necessarily settle the question of criminal accountability, especially when the alleged tax gap runs into the billions. Now, a judge will decide whether the case proceeds to trial, which would mark the first time a major big tech company faces a criminal tax case tied to its platform model in Italy. And for the viewers at home, this should matter because governments around the world are increasingly trying to figure out how to tax global digital platforms. And if this case moves forward, it can become a blueprint for similar prosecutions all across Europe. Over in Mexico, the government says it will deploy roughly 100,000 security personnel for the upcoming FIFA World Cup, which is generally not the number you announce unless you're trying very hard to convince the world everything is totally under control. The reassurance campaign comes just weeks after Mexican forces killed El Mencho, the leader of the powerful Jalisco New Generation cartel. The cartel's response was immediate. Buses and vehicles were set on fire across Jalisco. 4 professional soccer matches were postponed, and some airlines even suspended flights into the region. And one detail that makes the situation slightly more awkward: the stadium hosting World Cup games there sits about 60 miles from where El Mencho was ultimately killed. Analysts warn removing a cartel leader of that size can sometimes fracture the organization into competing factions, meaning the violence doesn't disappear, it simply becomes more decentralized. The World Cup kicks off June 11th in Mexico City, and Mexico is now racing to prove it can stabilize the situation before the world's biggest sporting event arrives. We're taking a break here at Roxom TV News, but when we return, we got more of this morning's top news stories. In just a bit, I'm going to be joined by one of my favorite guests of the program, Fernando, the Bitcoin libertarian, who's going to help break down all the madness. So stay tuned. More Roxom TV News coming your way right after this.
This is Alex. Alex spends most of his time thinking like a trader, still deciding what to do with his Bitcoin. While Alex waits for the perfect entry, this is Laura. She's watching the S&P drop. Everyone is suddenly a macro expert. She doesn't panic. This is Tom. No screens, no noise, no stress. While Tom focuses on his swing, his Bitcoin focuses on compounding. Because Bitcoiners don't want more dollars. They want more Bitcoin.
I want more Bitcoin.
The best move is letting your Bitcoin work while you plan the next one. Grow by Roxom. One currency, one place.
Are you interested in effortlessly growing your Bitcoin portfolio? Because I sure am. And the Bitcoin credit card by Gemini earns you Bitcoin back on every purchase. You can use it like any credit card. Buy lunch, gas, or your weekly groceries, and you'll earn up to 4% back instantly in Bitcoin or one of over 50 other cryptos straight to your account. All that with no annual fee. And right now, you can grab a $200 Bitcoin welcome bonus. It's the easiest way to start building your Bitcoin stack. Just go to Gemini.com to learn more. Welcome back to Roxom TV News. Something pretty unusual is happening in the world of Bitcoin Treasury companies this week, and it revolves around the company's Strategy, the firm that already holds the largest corporate pile of Bitcoin on the planet. Strategy's preferred stock program, known as STRC, recently had its most explosive trading day yet, with real-time trackers estimating the capital raised could fund the purchase of more than 4,000 Bitcoin in a single day. Now, to put that into perspective, roughly 7.3 million STRC shares traded on March 12th, which is about 471% higher than the stock's normal daily trading volume. Now, the surge extended the company's at-the-market issuance streak to 9 straight days. And based on the models analysts are using to track the capital flowing into the program, that activity alone could fund the purchase of roughly 4,038 Bitcoin. And the speed of that accumulation has been unusually fast. You see, analysts tracking the issuance say that STRC crossed the threshold that would fund 3,000 Bitcoin purchases and then pushed past the level needed to fund 4,000 Bitcoin in less than 90 minutes, while the stock itself remained relatively stable near its $100 par value. That stability seems to be part of the attraction here. You see, unlike Strategy's common stock, which tends to swing around quite a bit with Bitcoin's price, STRC is designed to appeal to income-focused investors, offering an annualized dividend yield of roughly 11.5%. So, from an investor's perspective, it behaves less like a speculative tech stock and more like an income-producing financial instrument. Except the capital raised from it is quietly being used to buy more Bitcoin. Zooming out, the numbers get even more interesting. Based on current tracker estimates, the STRC program has now raised enough capital this week alone to fund the purchase of more than 10,000 Bitcoin, which would represent roughly $710 million worth of Bitcoin at current market prices. These numbers are still estimates for now, and the official figures will likely appear later in a future SEC filing. But if they hold up, it would represent another major expansion of Strategy's already enormous Bitcoin treasury. As of its most recent confirmed disclosure earlier this month, the company held 738,731 Bitcoin, making it by far the largest corporate Bitcoin holder in the world. Now, the structure behind STRC is actually pretty straightforward. It's a perpetual preferred stock with a stated value of $100 per share, and it's designed to take demand from capital markets and channel it directly into Bitcoin purchases. Investors buy the preferred shares for income, collecting a variable monthly dividend currently running around 11.5%, and Strategy uses that capital to expand its Bitcoin holdings without selling any of the Bitcoin it already owns. Of course, like any preferred security, it isn't risk-free. The dividend isn't guaranteed because it still has to be declared by the company's board. The yield can change, market conditions can shift, and the shares themselves do not represent a direct claim on the company's Bitcoin treasury. Interest rates, broader market conditions, and changes to Strategy's capital structure could all affect the stock's price or payout over time. But the bigger picture here is what's really interesting. Strategy has essentially created a system where traditional financial markets are quietly being turned into continuous Bitcoin accumulation machines. Income-focused investors buy STRC for the yield. Strategy takes that capital and converts it into Bitcoin. And the larger the company's Bitcoin treasury grows, the stronger the balance sheet becomes, which in turn attracts even more investor demand. It's a feedback loop, and right now it's running at full speed. And there's another twist to this story as well. For investors who actually want to receive those dividends in Bitcoin instead of dollars, the Bitcoin-denominated exchange Roxom recently began offering STRC exposure with payouts converted directly into Bitcoin, which means the yield investors earn from the preferred stock can show up not as cash, but as Bitcoin deposited straight into their account. Or in other words, financial markets are now starting to design entire investment products whose primary function is raising capital to buy Bitcoin, which is a pretty strong signal that Bitcoin is continuing to push deeper into the architecture of traditional finance. All right, we're going to take a quick break here at RoxomTV News, but when we're back, we got more of today's top stories, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break.
Some call me Chicken Little, others Bubble Boy. I'm a bit changed, but sounds familiar, right? Let me tell you a hard truth. The S&P isn't rising, the dollar's falling. That's the trick, monopoly money. It's ice melting by the second. Your savings, your salary, your time. Worth less every second. Everyone's using the wrong measuring stick. Switch the denominator. Price the S&P into Bitcoin. Hard, fixed, unprintable. Suddenly your unstoppable index, it's collapsing. And while you cling to dollars, well, Wall Street already switched. Before, you needed two brokers.
Still getting my ninja bonus though, right?
Fuck. Plenty of spreadsheets. And my quant!
I hate this part.
I was right, and I'll be right again. If I were you, I'd thank me.
You know my name's Dave, right?
Welcome back to RoxomTV News. The war between the United States and Iran has now entered its third week, and depending on who you listen to, it's either almost over or not very much over at all. Earlier this week, President Trump told leaders during a G7 video call that Iran was essentially on the verge of surrender, reportedly saying the only complication was that nobody seemed entirely sure who the country's leader actually was, which made it difficult for someone to formally announce that surrender. Now, the timing of that statement turned out to be, well, unfortunate, because roughly 24 hours later, the man Trump had suggested might not even be leading Iran, Mojtaba Khamenei, released his first public message as the country's new supreme leader, and it sounded nothing like the words of someone preparing to wave a white flag. Instead, the statement declared that the Strait of Hormuz should remain closed as a tool of pressure against the enemy, demanded the closure of the U.S. military bases across the Middle East, and warned that Iran would open new fronts in places where the United States has little experience and high vulnerability. So the president says the war may be nearing its end. The man now leading Iran says it may only be beginning. And according to reporting from Reuters and CNN, U.S. intelligence agencies appear to lean much closer to Iran's interpretation of the situation. Internal assessments reviewed by Reuters concluded the Iranian regime is not close to collapsing and still maintains control over the country despite weeks of airstrikes and economic pressure. CNN also reported that Pentagon planners underestimated Iran's willingness to close the Strait of Hormuz, which carries roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. During that same G7 call, several leaders urged Trump to end the war quickly and reopen the strait before the economic fallout spreads further. Meanwhile, the conflict itself continues to escalate. Israel launched another round of strikes on Tehran Friday morning. Heavy explosions were reported across the capital, and mass evacuation orders in Lebanon are pushing potential displacement toward 1 million people. This was the scene overnight in Beirut. Take a look. No clip. Okay. I wasn't sure about that one. All right. We didn't have a clip for that one. It's a live show. So while Washington's messaging suggests victory could be close, the battlefield picture remains far more complicated. Now, the financial cost of the war is also becoming impossible for anyone to ignore. According to a Pentagon briefing to lawmakers, the first week alone cost roughly $11.3 billion, covering munitions, logistics, fuel, and the massive air campaign now underway across the region. And that number is rising quickly enough that the administration is already discussing additional war funding, while lawmakers in Congress begin pushing back. At the same time, the administration is scrambling to manage the oil shock. Late Thursday night, it issued a 30-day waiver, allowing, and this thing just moved in it. Got rid of my place in the... Sorry, guys. It's a live show, and my prompter just totally moved here again. You know, guys, I want to bring in our guests. So I want to bring our author and political analyst and guest today, Reza Bulorchi, to talk about what is going on in Iran. Reza, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. How are you?
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be on your show.
Yeah, no, the pleasure is all ours, Reza, and we've got a lot to talk about this morning. And let's start with the big picture here, okay? President Trump is saying that Iran is close to surrendering, while the U.S. intelligence agencies are saying the regime is still very much in control. From your perspective, which assessment is closer to the reality of the situation right now?
Well, the real solution, the ultimate effective solution to Iran crisis, even before this round of war and conflict, has always been the end of the clerical regime in Iran. Everything that you look at, from the nuclear crisis to the missile program to the terrorism in the Middle East, everything that you look at, from domestic suppression, lack of freedom, everything boils down to one thing. This regime must go. But the question is, no foreign war, no bombing, no airstrikes can lead to fall of this regime. And we have seen that in the past. We saw it in the June 12-day war, and we see it now. Because given the nature of this regime and the fact that they have prepared for past 4 decades themselves, written their playbook of survival, it should be done by the Iranian people, by their organized resistance from inside Iran. And that's the way that democratic change and the change to this regime will come, not by bombing, and not by anything else. That's why the situation we see right now is that expectations for the Iranian regime to fall because of these heavy bombings and the 2 weeks of conflict is kind of far-fetched. What should be done is to look at inside Iran, the real agent for change inside Iran, which are the people. And we saw them in January uprisings, how ferociously all over Iran, they took on the regime, but they were massacred because they were in empty hands. It was trying to change the regime and bring down the regime, just by pure protesting, which the regime's response was quite clear, massacring, the protesters in the thousands and thousands, and more than 50,000 people have been arrested so far. So, but if that January uprising, for example, was in tandem with the organized resistance, then we would have a different outcome. And that is what should be the focus of the outside world, to look at inside Iran, and the real forces for change are inside Iran.
And Reza, we're talking about, replacing the current regime. How do you foresee that something like that even happening? Because we're seeing them just punish resistors. You've seen there's been tons of deaths in Iran of people opposing the current regime. Like, how does that even happen? If bombs aren't going to do it, ultimately, what would have to happen? Is this a boots on the ground situation where troops would have to go into Iran and do it kind of like we had with Iraq years ago? Or how do you see this regime actually collapsing and a new one being put in its place? What would have to happen?
Yeah, not at all. Boots on the ground will not, foreign boots on the ground will not resolve the situation. We have seen it in Iraq, Afghanistan, other places. It leads to more chaos, to more instability, to more problems, and does not bring democracy and the rule of law for that nation. Yes, boots on the ground, yes, but Iranian boots on the ground, I should say. And that's what I mean by organized
Yeah.
resistance. What is heading this organized resistance is an organization which has been in a struggle for democracy against the dictatorship of the Shah and the mullahs in the past 60 years. They have faced, and that's the organization called MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq. More than 100,000 of their supporters and their activists have been executed and killed by this regime since 1979. Just in 1988 alone, 30,000 of their political prisoners affiliated with these organizations were massacred. If you go on Google, do a 1988 prisoner massacre of political prisoners in Iran, you would be horrified of the stories there. And that resistance goes on. In fact, what was lost in the headline just a few days before the war broke out, when everybody was discussing, if it's going to be an attack or not an attack. In fact, the fighters of this organization launched a daring attack on the compound of Khamenei, which 5, 6 days later came under bombardment. They attacked that in order to deprive the regime from, its most stabilizing, person, which was the supreme leader. And that attack, more than 100 of MEK fighters were arrested and martyred, but 150 managed to go back to their bases. So when an organization has this capacity and this daring objective to take on this regime in this manner, it shows level of planning. It shows level of organization. It's an also level of desire to do this. It's an organization that does not fear the sacrifice needed to pay for the freedom of Iran. So yes, the boots on the ground are needed, but they should be, and they have to be Iranian boots on the ground to bring this regime down. And also, this organization is a part of a bigger coalition called the National Council of Resistance of Iran, which was formed in 1981, particularly for this reason, that to provide a leadership when the time comes that regime change is feasible. It has a plan and a strategy to overthrow this regime, and also, more importantly, a very well-defined roadmap and plan for the post-Ayatollah's Iran, the day after. How the transition would be done, how would the popular sovereignty will be transferred from this regime, how would the sovereignty will be transferred from this regime to a government which represents the will of Iranian people through elections, fair and elections that they can decide their own future, what type of republic they want, what type of sort of a constitution they want.
And Reza, I've got a question for you. We've seen a lot of developments here with this in just the last couple of weeks. One specifically happened in the last week where it looks like a Tomahawk missile crashed into a girls' school and killed hundreds of young women. Just really tragic. And I know that a lot of the Iranian people are obviously opposed to the regime, but then you see stories like this come out, and it's definitely not a good look for the United States. So my question for you is, what is kind of the perception of America right now by the Iranian people as a whole? Are they welcoming this challenge to the regime, or are they maybe not thrilled about the U.S.'s involvement in this? I mean, they just, killed a school of hundreds of girls at a school. So how is America being perceived right now by the Iranian people? I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, first of all, first and foremost, Iranian people see this regime, particularly Khamenei and his son. This last name is a despised last name inside Iran. And so they look at the past 4 decades of atrocities, of loss of lives, particularly in the January uprising, that we are talking about thousands and thousands of Iranians massacred by this regime. If you look at the names and the pictures of the young or Gen Z, brave boys and girls who took on the streets and to bring this regime down, you see that they see this regime as the center of all the miseries that has happened to them, since 1979. Yes, war is always, has this sort of, disasters coming to the civilians, people who have nothing to do with this. Although this story about this school is still, being debated, being investigated by different sides. But what matters is that, as the leader of the Iranian resistance and National Council of Resistance has said, Mariam Rajavi, that all the sides involved must do their utmost to stop and prevent damage to infrastructure, to civilian targets, and to avoid loss of innocent lives in this matter. Because even if you look at all the major infrastructure that we have, at the end of the day, they belong to the Iranian people. They are what has been built by using their, treasure and their wealth. When I mentioned Mrs. Mariam Rajavi, one thing I should also emphasize, that as a responsible leader, who has put out a 10-point plan, people ask, what is your plan for the future of Iran? Well, this is a well-defined 10-point plan, which says that the future transitional government would be based on separation of church and state, religion and states, equal rights for women. It would be demolish of and abolition of all, IRGC and all the centers of, the suppression inside Iran. Iran would be a non-nuclear country, and many other items that has been received by more than 140 former heads of the states as a plan that can guarantee Iran's orderly transition to a democratic government. General James Jones, the former national security advisor, has called this a Jeffersonian plan. And late Senator Joseph Lieberman has called this plan very similar, has the spirit of the Americans' Bill of Rights. So everything is in place. What all we need is for the boots on the ground, the resistance units of this opposition, do their utmost to bring this regime down in the strategy that could work. All we need from the outside world is that to recognize the legitimate rights of Iranians, particularly youth and these resistance units, to take on the IRGC. IRGC centers are under attack right now. Fine. But what is more important is that for the outside world to also recognize the rights of Iranians themselves to take on the IRGC, to attack their bases, to deprive them as an act of self-defense from their ability to massacre and to kill Iranians and conduct terror throughout Iran and beyond its borders.
Yeah, this is definitely a situation where it seems like we're going to require all hands on deck to find a solution here. And I am glad to hear that it sounds like in this situation, maybe the United States is not in the wrong side of history with one, because it sounds like that regime has been ruling with an iron fist for Iran for a long time, and the people are sick of it. So I'm glad to hear it sounds like we're on the right side of history and helping out with that. But with that being said, we saw the Ayatollah was killed. Then his son has now stepped in, Mojtaba Khamenei, and he now issued his first statement as Iran's new supreme leader, and it sounded pretty defiant. So my question for you, Reza, is how seriously should the world take this first message from Mojtaba Khamenei? Because I believe there are even reports that he's injured. Do you think he's going to make this a long and drawn-out fight, or do you think maybe they really don't have the infrastructure for that type of thing here. What did you make of his first message?
Yes, a couple of things. First of all, one of the biggest mistakes of this regime, which is out of desperation, out of being caught in a corner, was to name him as the successor to Khamenei, to his father, because the last name itself is a major Achilles heel for this guy. You know, he's going to be known as the baby Khamenei. He's not going to, because he doesn't have the criteria that was envisioned in Iran's constitution for a supreme leader. Nobody has heard about him because he has any executive jobs or anything. You know, Khamenei, before he became the supreme leader, for years was the president of the Islamic Republic, and then he was the commander in chief of the army for a while before that. So he doesn't have any of that in his resume. All he knows is that he's the son of Ali Khamenei. Yes, that's true. And also we have to bear in mind that all these years behind the scene, he was the actual effective deputy to his father. You know, in all the activities, rogue activities this regime had outside of its borders, terrorism, proxy wars, and all that, he was directly involved in the plunder of Iran's wealth. And as the new expose in British newspapers have revealed, he has a major financial network outside of Iran, properties and all that. And also, as far as the suppression of the people, cracking down, quashing protests, peaceful protests in Iran, he has been very much involved. But he's following his dad's playbook for survival. Just double down. Whenever, even if we saw in last June's, military war and the war, that Khamenei doubled down. Let's do, because that's not from a position of a strength. That's a position of gambling. That now that you have nothing going on for you, you just double down and become more aggressive, be more belligerent. Also, you have to keep in mind the actual loyal forces of this regime, like the IRGC and their families, and whatever other fan base they have. They want raw meat, and Mojtaba is throwing them raw meat, as far as belligerence and all that, because they need to show a pretense of power, that we're in charge, we're not going to give up, and we're not going to capitulate to them. So then those people can go to the streets and massacre, any potential, uprisings that could happen today, a week from now, a month from now. So that's why I see it. That's how I see it. That as far as it is very strange that for his first message as the supreme leader of this regime, there's a written statement read by a TV anchor person. Not even it's not his voice, let alone it doesn't show their face. It wasn't even his voice. It was just a text read on national TV by an anchor person. So why is that? So is he injured? Is he in hospital? Is he whatever it is? That remains to be seen. In fact, the rumor mill in Iran has gone up. After this message was read on TV without showing him or even broadcasting his voice. So that's one thing to keep an eye on.
That's super interesting, Reza. And I had not heard of that. And that kind of relates to a bigger narrative we've seen over the course of this conflict is, Iranian state media is tightly controlling information right now. Yes. Apparently, the internet is reportedly down to about 1% of normal levels. So my question for you is, what does that mean for how ordinary Iranians are able to understand what's actually going on right now if all of the ability to get information is being suppressed like that?
Yes. As you said, internet is very much being, put a choke on it. It happens whenever there is a major uprising, there is a major crisis for the regime inside Iran. It has two primary objectives. First of all, to deprive Iranians and from the outside world, that is information in the outside world, vice versa. The outside world from what Iranians are doing and what they're going through. At the same time, deprive Iranians to communicate with each other about what they are doing. That tactic was used during January uprisings this year. That one of the primary objective of shutting down the internet was the regime did not want Iranians know that in the city, the in north, for example, there's a major uprising in the streets, so they get motivated, they get inspired, and they come to the streets as well. So that was also a tactic they used to have these silos of protests here and there without people being able to connect with each other and get coordinate, make plans, and try to
Yeah.
merge with each other. Right now, the situation is kind of similar, but the regime is also making profit from this by through its, we call it the VPN mafia inside Iran. These are,
Yeah.
state-sponsored and state-owned, uh, so-called private companies. They sell VPN software of different kinds. Many of them are dubious. Many of them are riddled, with spyware and all that, provided by Chinese companies and here and there to sell it to people desperate to get the news out of Iran to send their clips. I've heard many people that they say when they send a clip of an explosion or a bombardment, they say that, yes, with my VPN, I have only 5 minutes, so I try to send these clips and say what's going on. If I didn't talk to you, maybe tomorrow I'll connect again and send more information. So that is why another way by the regime to not only make profit, also control this whole internet sphere in Iran.
And with the lack of information that we're seeing in the conflict, what do you feel like is the current trajectory of what we're seeing right now? Because this war is entering its third week. The economy is clearly under pressure. The leadership, as you mentioned, seems to be doubling down. Where do you think Iran is actually heading from here? Are they just going to be creating chaos in the Strait of Hormuz till gas costs $10 a gallon? What do you think is ultimately their plan going forward?
Yes, as I said, it is and it has always been everything in the past 4 decades in Iran since 1979 about the survival of this regime. They are willing to sacrifice any Iranian, any treasure, their national treasure, any infrastructure inside Iran and also outside of Iran, in the neighbors, in the Persian Gulf, in order to survive. Their nuclear program was not out of their interest in this modern science. Their nuclear program, weapons program was about they from the day, early days, they saw it as a tool of survival. It was a component of the survival playbook. Terrorism, export of revolution, the doctrine of export of revolution was also was viewed as a guarantee for their survival, because they knew from the day one there's going to be one day, could be a week, could be a month, could be 10 years, 40 years, that the Iranian people are going to make a stand against them. The outside world is going to make a stand against them because so backward and they're so belligerent, intransigent. So they came up with this idea of export of revolution. So under the guise of this, they could cultivate terror organizations outside of Iran, in the Middle East and in North Africa, elsewhere. They have sleeper cells in Europe and other places, and they call their missile programs, their nuclear weapons programs. They were all about this. Now, if it's about their survival, if nothing else is going on inside Iran, then they will continue as much as they can, to protect themselves. But what is key here is that when the dust of war is going to settle down, this is where we're going to see the population, the beginning of the readiness of the people, for another round of major popular uprising, and which this time would be totally different event from the January one, because this time is going to be in tandem with the organized resistance and our boots on the ground, the Iranian boots on the ground inside Iran. It could happen a week after the war is over, 2 weeks, a month, but it's going to happen, no doubt. And the resistance by itself cannot bring this regime down, the organized resistance, but it can in combination with another popular uprising similar to the January uprising.
And I was excited when I heard we were having you on the program, Reza, because I saw that you co-wrote a book titled "Where is Iran Heading?" And it was written back in 2017, though, and the subtitle framed the regime as being in a battle for supremacy or survival, which you kind of just touched on. So my question for you is, 9 years after you wrote the book, do you feel that framing still holds up, or has this situation maybe evolved into something different since then?
Absolutely. As I said, I could have wrote that in 2001 or 2000, even 1997. It still would have hold, because, as I said, it has been always about survival by projecting supremacy inside Iran and also outside its borders. Because this pretense of power is what this regime thrives on, domestically and also on foreign domains, in the regional domains, is that you're such a big monster, in the room. You're such a huge thing in the 10 feet tall, that you better not take on us. But then, when this house of cards is sort of, broken, then they just double down. How much, headlines, the Iranians heard it since the June 12 war about, we have improved 10 times our air defenses. We have our rocket, technology, this and that we saw in this war. How, everything came down in less than 24 hours. This is what they survive on. The specter and the projection of power and supremacy is that what they hide, their intrinsic weakness inside Iran, which they don't have any plan to resolve the bread and butter issues of the Iranian people, the economic questions. Everything is like a band-aid. Economy inside Iran is because of the oil money and everything. No planning, no long-term planning. Everything is just that we export oil, we use the money, throw it at people, some of it, but most of it, we try to buy missiles or make missiles or buy terror groups outside of Iran, give it to our nuclear weapons program and all that. No, they have no strategic solution. Even tomorrow, if they want to do something, they have no strategic solution for any of Iran's deep economic, social, and cultural issues. And they know that. The fact that they know that they don't have, that's why they have to barge on this sort of, projection of supremacy, and this, which is in fact a way of, survival.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. If you don't have answers to these problems, it's not that surprising that they're going to scare tactics instead in an effort to maintain order.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and this is, it's obviously a very much ongoing conflict and saga in Iran. And Reza, I really want to thank you for your time today. It was such a treat to have somebody who's really knowledgeable about what is going on there and getting some real answers, because I think we're all really hoping for a resolution to this sooner than later. And we're all really, praying for the Iranian people that this regime can get ousted so that we can, bring some stability back to the region. And again, I want to thank you for your time today. I'm sure you gained at least a couple of fans in our viewing audience this morning, Reza.
I hope so.
We had anybody out. Yeah, you definitely did. So if anybody out there wanted to get some more information about your books or maybe what you're up to, is there like an X account or a website I can send them to if they wanted to learn more?
Yes, of course. They have an account on X, ABLRCHI, that, I from time to time I post things in there about, I just post about, Iran and the political situation in there, and more importantly, the way forward, because what matters right now is not that how bad this regime is. The question is, what is the solution? What the internal opposition, the MEK, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and its leader, Maryam Rajavi, bring to the table as far as this perspective. What are the resistance units of this organization doing inside Iran? What is their role, and how they're going to manage to work with the people in order to have a formidable army of people, national liberation army against this regime. So I usually post about this sort of things, both mostly in English, but sometimes in Farsi as well. When that goes, but yes, I'm happy to answer any questions and anything come, and I truly appreciate this. As as we have announced, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi has announced the formation of the provisional government. In fact, announcing the readiness of the alternative, the opposition of alternative, to handle the post-overthrow affairs of Iran towards democratic governance. We are happy that things are going to move fast inside Iran. It's a matter of time now, but we will see the ultimate result, the ultimate solution, which is the overthrow of this regime, hopefully soon.
Yeah, and we're so appreciative of voices like yourself that are, this conflict, especially here in the United States, can literally feel a world away. And when you get to actually hear about the people and what's happening on the ground, it really adds the additional context that I think the world needs to really start taking what's going on over there a little more seriously, and understanding that while it may feel like a world away, the implications for the rest of us here in the world are very real. So I really want to thank you again for your time and expertise and insights today, Reza. It was a real pleasure. And I hope you have a good weekend, and I'm praying for good news out of Iran in the near future.
Same here, and it was really a pleasure of mine, Hank. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's all ours. Cheers. Have a nice weekend, Reza. Okay. All right, we're taking a break here at RoxomTV News, gang. But when we're back, I'm going to be joined by my co-host for our second hour, the one and only Roxom, co-host himself, Walker America, the most patriotic man in Bitcoin. It's clearly Friday here. I need a nap. We'll be right back with more RoxomTV News after this break. Welcome back to RoxomTV News. We're jumping into our second hour of programming today. And of course, it is Friday, which means I'm going to be joined by the one and only Walker America. Walker, welcome to the show. Always great to co-host with you and wrap up the week in style. How are you this Friday?
Oh, doing well. Never a dull moment here in the great wide world. So excited to dig into a bunch of different stories with you today. And I think we've got a pretty interesting guest coming on as well.
We do. We've got a fun guest. I don't want to tease it quite yet because I want to keep the people, I want to reel them in real slow like a largemouth bass. But we've got some stories that you and I are going to get caught up in first, and then we'll be welcoming in our guest in just a bit. So what do you say we dive on into things?
Well, let's do it, Hank.
All right, let's rock and roll. I'll take these first two. Starting off with the Trump administration. Well, they recently lifted certain sanctions on Russian oil, not as a favor, but as an emergency attempt to keep global energy prices from spiraling even higher during the widening Middle East conflict. The Treasury Department issued a 30-day waiver allowing countries to purchase Russian crude that is already stranded at sea, which currently amounts to roughly 124 million barrels floating around global shipping lanes looking for a buyer. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called the move narrowly tailored and insisted it would not provide significant financial benefit to the Russian government. Russia, somewhat unsurprisingly, disagrees. Kremlin envoy Kirill Dmitriev posted on X, and I'll quote it exactly, by saying, "Buy Russian oil and gas to maintain a balanced energy supply." European leaders, well, they're furious, arguing that sanctions were originally designed to punish Russia for its invasion of the Ukraine, not to be relaxed during another geopolitical crisis. Take a peek.
Unfortunately, Russia continues to show no willingness to negotiate. We will and we must therefore have to increase the pressure on Moscow. I want to make this very clear. Easing sanctions now, for whatever reason, is something we believe is wrong. We will continue our support for Ukraine. We will not be deterred or distracted from this by the war in Iran.
Analysts estimate that Russia could earn around $150 million per day in additional oil revenue during the waiver period, which raises the awkward geopolitical question hovering over all this. When energy markets start panicking, sanctions can suddenly become a lot more flexible. And for those of you tuning in from home, this matters because oil prices ripple through everything. Gas stations, airline tickets, inflation. That means that decisions made in Washington and Moscow often show up a few days later on your credit card statement. So get excited for that. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, financial markets had their worst day of 2026 after a single statement out of Iran rattled investors across the entire global economy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 739 points, while the S&P 5 fell 1.52%, and the Nasdaq slid 1.78%. Now, the catalyst came from Mojtaba Khamenei, who suggested the Strait of Hormuz should remain closed as a tool to pressure the enemy. That narrow shipping lane handles roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. So when someone even hints at shutting it down, markets tend to react with the emotional stability of all of my ex-girlfriends. It's not good. Efforts to calm investors didn't exactly work either. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels of reserves, and the United States added another 172 million barrels from its strategic petroleum reserve, yet oil prices kept on climbing. Bloomberg economists estimate that a 3-month Hormuz closure could send crude prices to $164 a barrel. Before the conflict escalated, Brent crude had been at a much more comfortably $60 to $70 per barrel. It recently closed near 100, and markets are now adjusting everything from airline stocks to inflation forecasts to Federal Reserve interest rate cuts. And for those of you who are watching this at home and saying, this won't affect me, well, guess what? It will. Because when these types of things happen, oil is going to spike and it doesn't stay in the energy sector. It moves to groceries, your travel costs, shipping prices, and ultimately making everything in your life much more expensive. Walker, I want to bring you in for this. Are you ready? Are you feeling the cost of living creep up by you at all? I'm in California, so it just feels like everything is astronomically expensive over time. Are you feeling it where you are in the Midwest at all?
I mean, probably not as bad as you are in California, excuse me. But you know, I think this is the thing. In the slow creep of fiat inflation through monetary debasement is just that. It's typically a slow creep. This is one of the most insidious things about it, is that people don't notice. You don't notice just a little bit, 2% year over year. That's kind of easy to get into that frog in the boiling pot situation, right? You just, it's not this big flash up. I mean, hyperinflation, you notice day after day, you notice from the morning to the evening, but just good old fashioned regular fiat inflation, slow and steady destruction of your purchasing power, it's harder to notice. But then you have these flash points, and typically it comes back to energy, right? Energy is the base layer of everything we do. Energy prices, when they go up, they make everything else more expensive because you need energy to do literally everything. So I think that these times when we start to see inflation not just creep up, but start to run a little bit, that's when people start really paying attention, because they may notice. We all remember during the COVID times, at first there was no inflation. And all of a sudden it turns out when you print, trillions and trillions of dollars in the space of a couple of years, that starts to make prices go up. Who could have thunk it? But, it's times like these when they get hit in the pocketbook, when you get hit in your wallet, that's when people really start to get pissed off, honestly. And it's a midterm year. So, things are going to get interesting.
Oh, it's interesting in the worst way. I went to Trader Joe's the other day and I paid $8 for blueberries. So I know it's bad.
God.
I'm feeling it in the blueberry aisle.
Dear Lord.
Yeah. I think you need to read a story because I need to think about my life choices about living in California. Here for
need a little palate cleanse. But as I like to remind you, you still got the sunshine. So at least there's that. That's about it. Yeah, we're going to jump right into our next story here so Hank can go and meditate on his life choices, because the Senate just passed the largest housing bill in decades. Any investor who owns 350 or more single-family homes is banned from buying more. Investors who build or renovate can still own them, but must sell within 7 years. Trump pushed for the ban and wouldn't sign the bill without it. Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren co-sponsored, one of the only things they've ever agreed on. The bill has 40-plus provisions to boost supply, streamlined environmental reviews, pre-approved housing designs, lifting the bank investment cap for affordable housing from 15% to 20%. The U.S. housing shortage is estimated at 4 million units. A typical home sells for $400,000, well above what the median family can afford. Not everyone's happy. Senator Schatz called the cap bananas and warned it'll kill the build-to-rent market and displace renters. Now it goes back to the House for reconciliation. And next, Strategies STRC Surge funds 10,000 plus Bitcoin a week. Strategy recorded its most explosive day yet for its STRC preferred stock, with real-time trackers estimating that trading activity generated enough capital to fund the purchase of roughly 4,038 Bitcoin in a single session. About 7.3 million STRC shares traded yesterday, March 12th, which was roughly 471% of the average daily volume. The surge extended the program's at-the-market issuance streak to 9 consecutive days and, based on tracker models, has now raised enough capital this week to fund more than 10,000 Bitcoin, or roughly $710 million at prevailing prices. The STRC structure effectively turns investor demand for yield into direct Bitcoin accumulation. The perpetual preferred stock currently offers an annualized dividend rate of around 11.5%, while the capital raised is funneled into expanding Strategy's already massive Bitcoin treasury, which stood at 738,731 Bitcoin, wow, in its most recent filing. For investors who want exposure to that yield directly paid in Bitcoin, the Bitcoin-denominated exchange Roxom now offers STRC dividends settled in BTC, allowing holders to receive 11.5% payout as Bitcoin rather than dollars. Hank, I want to bring you back up for this one here. We covered this, the Roxom's STRC Bitcoin dividend launch yesterday. I'm curious, too, I'd like to maybe get your thoughts on the single-family homes. I mean, it's amazing to see folks like Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren kind of coming across the aisle for something. You know, I always wonder with these sorts of things, though, because I just have a healthy distrust for the government. What am I missing here where this is actually screwing people? On its surface, this seems to be kind of a good thing, but I also worry how many things are going to be in this bill that end up not having the desired effect that they actually, purport to have. What's your read on it?
Ooh, yeah, in terms of what gets slipped in that bill, I can't really speak to that, but I can speak to the housing crisis, affordability crisis in this country that's out of control. And I'm all for the BlackRocks and other big institutions of the world not buying up all the single family homes so that I can never afford a home in my lifetime, at least not in California. That's for damn sure. These are things that need to happen. The middle class is evaporating by the day and getting squeezed out by these big money and big institutions. So I'm all for it. It's just the promises that you and I had growing up, because I think you're probably like me, like kind of in that millennial range or close. It's just like the boomers screwed us, man. And the algorithms have found that out too. I'm getting a lot of anti-boomer videos recently, but it's like the most selfish, self-involved generation of all time, just leaving us with crumbs when they lived a life of luxury and privilege. So yeah, whatever we can do to right that ship, I doubt this will end up ultimately doing it. But I am excited about any kind of bipartisan agreements. We used to do that as a country. We used to do what was best for the country, not what was best for our party exclusively. In some of we have to win, or we don't, if we don't win totally, we can't win at all, and that's kind of where we are now. So I'm excited about that. It makes me slightly optimistic about the world going forward. But I'm also a realist, so not really. That's my take. Where do you land on this one, Walker?
Yeah, I mean, all of this comes back to money printing, right? It's like, why are houses so unaffordable? Well, it's because, wages haven't kept pace with inflation, right? The price of, a boomer that bought their house for a bushel of raspberries in the 1970s rode the biggest wave of monetary debasement in U.S. history, right? They just basically, their house was printed to millions of dollars, right? It's not that the house got, if you look at areas like Silicon Valley is a great example of this, these tiny little houses, it's like, it's not like the house got more expensive. There's more demand in the area, of course. You've also got a lot of the, the NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard, people not wanting to have things built around, but that's a lot of the boomers too, right? But I think at the end of the day, the core issue here, not, it's the boomers benefited from it, but the core issue was we printed so much dang money. We debased the heck out of the currency. And while productivity increased, wages didn't keep pace with that or with the pace of inflation. And so anyone that didn't buy their house for a bushel of raspberries is kind of, up a creek with no canoe here. So, it's like, this is why we got to get back to always the root problem, fix the money. And a lot of these downstream effects get fixed as well.
Yeah, it's outrageous. They're buying their houses for raspberries. I'm paying $8 or $9 for blueberries at Trader Joe's. What else could go wrong? We got to take a break here, Walker. But in just a bit, gang, we're going to be joined by our guest of the hour, investigative journalist Bill Conroy, to help us make sense of the chaos in this ever increasingly crazy world. So stay tuned. More RoxomTV news. Walker and I will be back with you right after this.
Some call me Chicken Little, others Bubble Boy. I'm a bit changed, but sounds familiar, right? Let me tell you a hard truth. The S&P isn't rising, the dollar's falling. That's the trick, monopoly money. It's ice melting by the second. Your savings, your salary, your time. Worth less every second. Everyone's using the wrong measuring stick. Switch the denominator. Price the S&P into Bitcoin. Hard, fixed, unprintable. Suddenly your unstoppable index, it's collapsing. And while you cling to dollars, well, Wall Street already switched. Before, you needed 2 brokers.
Still getting my ninja bonus though, right?
Fuck. Plenty of spreadsheets. And my quant!
I hate this part.
I was right, and I'll be right again. If I were you, I'd thank me.
You know my name's Dave, right?
Security matters. Zappo Bank, the only way to bank your Bitcoin. Apply now at zappobank.com.
Welcome back to RoxomTV News. In Mexico, the government says it will deploy roughly 100,000 security personnel for the upcoming FIFA World Cup, which is generally not the number you announce unless you're trying very hard to convince the world that everything is totally under control. The reassurance campaign comes just weeks after Mexican forces killed El Mencho, the leader of the powerful Jalisco New Generation cartel. The cartel's response was immediate. Buses and vehicles were set ablaze across Jalisco. 4 professional soccer matches were postponed, and some airlines even suspended flights into the region altogether. One detail that makes the situation slightly more awkward was the stadium hosting World Cup games there sits about 60 miles from where El Mencho was killed. Analysts warn that removing a cartel leader of that size can sometimes fracture the organization into competing factions, meaning the violence doesn't disappear, it simply becomes more decentralized. The World Cup kicks off June 11th in Mexico City, and Mexico is now racing to prove it can stabilize the situation before the world's biggest sporting event arrives. All right, so I want to bring Walker back, and joining Walker and I to talk about this story is investigative journalist Bill Conroy, who has spent years reporting on the drug war, cartel activity, and corruption on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. Bill, great to have you with us this morning. How are you?
I'm happy to be here.
Oh, well, we're happy to have you here, Bill, and there's a lot to talk about, especially with the great World Cup coming. So let's start with the headline. Mexico says it's deploying 100,000 security personnel for the World Cup that's coming up in June. From your experience, Bill, covering cartel violence and security operations, does that number signal strong preparation to you, or does it maybe suggest the government is genuinely concerned about the situation on the ground right now? What are your thoughts?
Probably both. It's too early to tell what's going to happen. There's some leftover leadership that's, like El Mencho's sister is one of the people they're looking at in the succession. They call her La Jefa, and another of his sons. But if that doesn't work out, if they can't maintain control, then, the cartel probably will fracture. And it'll be the different groups, within it that are in the leadership, or allied groups that might break away and try to do their own thing. They got a presence. This is the Jalisco cartel that El Mencho headed, the Jalisco New Generation, like 27 of the 32 states in Mexico and multiple foreign countries, including the U.S. Right? They move a lot of product, and they're also involved in oil theft and a lot of ancillary services outside of drug trafficking. So it's a huge criminal organization. and it's composed of a lot of fractions with a lot of apex wolves that would like to be in control. So the fact that they're deploying that much force for the World Cup just tells me that they don't know what's going to happen. I personally think it's unlikely they'll make the World Cup a target in any way, just because it's bad for business. It just brings more heat on them. But that doesn't mean passion doesn't overtake thinking, right, or rational thinking, and you have suddenly a break in the cartel, and then you have violence. You got to remember the Jalisco New Generation Cartel arose around 2010. And that was during the last phase, the last time that we, particularly the Mexican government, but we were helping them, had a major military assault on the cartels, right? And it basically destroyed the Juarez cartel, empowered the Sinaloa cartel, and gave rise to the Jalisco cartel, which is kind of a rival of the Sinaloa cartel. So that's where you might see some flashpoints, whether they, continue to fight over drug routes and plazas. That's where you'll see the violence. And, Jalisco, like Guadalajara, but also the ports, all the port cities along there, that's how they get drugs out, but they also move them north toward the border, the U.S. border. So all those drug routes and plazas are where the flashpoints are. And, Guadalajara, where they're holding a lot of the World Cup stuff, is kind of at the crossroads of the flashpoints. So it's going to be hard. It's hard to say right now what will happen. I don't think anyone knows.
Can I ask you, Bill? I mean, in terms of the actual situation on the ground, you see a lot of different reports in the media. It's often hard to know exactly what, how bad or not bad or misrepresented is the situation there right now. I mean, is what we're seeing right now, is this over and above, over the top what you're accustomed to from all of the study and research and on the ground work that you've done? Or is this kind of par for the course and it's just being reported on a lot more heavily just because the World Cup's upcoming and everything else? Can you help us separate kind of narrative from reality?
I think it's the latter. When you cover this stuff long enough, and I've been covering it since before 9/11, you see patterns emerge, and it goes through these militarization phases where they think they can attack the cartels and take them out with guns and military force. And that never works. It just fractures them. Because these are like really multiple criminal organizations that are, in many cases in alliance, and they stay together or work together because they make money. And so, we go through these phases, and then it'll quiet down because the situation on the ground, the chairs aren't being, reshuffled. And every time we blow up a cartel, the chairs get reshuffled, and we have more violence and actually probably more drug trafficking because there's more groups now trying to move drugs, right? And like I said, at the flashpoints and the plazas and the drug routes is where you'll have these huge cartel battles, and it's mostly. There's been about more than 200,000 people killed, murdered in the drug war in Mexico since the Calderon administration, which came into power in 2006 through 2012. And that's when that was the first war on cartels. He declared it and sent the military in and federal forces. And I was in Juarez when all that came into Juarez. And, the killing there was worse than Baghdad at the time. It was the most dangerous city in the world. And now it's settled down some because there's been some stability in the, if you will, the cartel world. But that is now getting shaken up again. And so we go into this new period of, the U.S. wants to throw more military force down there. They had this big security agreement. I've had these in the past, with I think there's like a dozen Latin American, South American, Central American countries. None of the big ones, Mexico and Brazil, no. But if we sink more military firepower down in there, or even deploy our special forces, it just, if you think about it, most of the guns down there that the cartels have come from the U.S. The military and federal police and state cops, not all of them, but they're all infiltrated by the cartels. So you put the military into the streets there, you don't know what you're getting. So that's why they've been using like the Marines, which have been heavily vetted, and but when you put that many troops into Guadalajara, what did they talk about? 100,000? Is that what you said? Not 1,000, but how many? That seems high. But the point is, the more military you throw at a situation in Mexico, the greater the risk that some of those generals or colonels are working for the cartel, because some of them do, and they're on the payroll. And that's the problem. You don't know. I mean, I think Scheinbahn is doing her damnedest. Every president there in Mexico has a huge. Every time they walk into office, their lives are threatened. They're dealing with all these forces that they don't really control in their own country because of the nature of it. And plus, they have the international pressure from the U.S. threatening to cut off, to tariff them to death, which would kill the Mexican economy and frankly would further hurt our economy. But that's the kind of over top view of the president. But underneath that is you have all the structure of government that's been infiltrated, bought off in different ways by criminal organizations, and a lot of these people you'd say and we're not immune from this. I don't know. We have our own form of corruption up here, but if you're given a choice between we're gonna pay you a nice tidy sum of money regularly, and you do what we say, or we're just going to kill you and your family. It's your choice. What do you think most people do? So it isn't always like these people are jumping to be in the criminal world. They're forced into it, and it's way down into the communities there, and it's a kind of a weird relationship because a lot of these cartels, the new generation did this in Guadalajara. They're kind of loved by many people and hated at the same time because they kind of maintain order. They put a lot of money into the community, but at the same time they bring a lot of bad, right? All the violence, the drug traffic. None of that is good. But on the other hand, it's what you have, and if that's what you have, and they're providing us a modicum of security to protect you from other cartels, and also, bringing some money into the community that's getting doled out, whether it's, however that's cycled into the community, you can see where you don't have a pure, I hate them or I love them kind of thing. It's very complex, and it's embedded in the society now. It's not unlike what we had during Prohibition, right? And with alcohol, everyone loved to drink it. There were a lot of people that loved to, they're just like people. If we stopped doing drugs, we wouldn't have this problem. I mean, that's what drives this, right? And then, how did that turn out? You had all these criminals running around that were folk heroes, right? And it's kind of like that. They're kind of folk heroes in many ways. But anyway, that's why I say sending a lot of military force against this problem tends to make it worse. At least it did the last time they did it. And we have a very good record of that. So I don't know why we're going back to it. I think people just don't remember, or that history gets erased, or it's never really reported in the mainstream media, because it's kind of if you listen to the mainstream media, it's kind of like like a Hollywood show, right? There's the good guys and the bad guys, and there's the white hats and the black hats. And there's a friend of mine who's now passed on, who was a drug war journalist, Chuck Bowden, said, in the drug war, nobody wears a white hat. And you got to come to grips with that. And until you see it through that prism, you're not going to understand the drug war.
Yeah, I've seen enough TV and movies, Bill. I think it's like when one of the snake's head gets chopped off, a three-headed snake comes up.
The Hydra,
place waiting to. Right. Yeah, the Hydra, exactly.
Yeah, that's a Greek myth, and that tells us for thousands of years we've had this problem, because it's based on, most of those myths have some basis in what it's a way of telling a story about the society. And so the Hydra exists because it exists. These criminal organizations have existed since Rome and Greece, just in different ways.
And to fully tell this story too, Bill, I want to kind of dial back here and think about like the broader context of what's going on right now, because Mexico has also been under a lot of pressure from Washington as of late to crack down harder on the cartels. We know Trump has talked about what's that drug that everybody's doing? What's the one? I'm talking about. Walker, you know what I'm talking about. The one that's popular on the streets with the kids these days. Fentanyl. Yes, it's the fentanyl thing. And, Trump's administration has been talking about potential drone strikes on the cartels. So my question for you, Bill, is how much do you think that pressure from the United States is shaping Mexico's current strategy in terms of corralling and trying to, control what's going on with the cartels down there?
Well, I think a lot, because there's a long history that from the point of view of the Mexicans, of a U.S. intervention in their country that's been, horrible for them. And so just the idea of unilateral U.S. military action in Mexico would create so many problems down there, right? It would just make it incredibly worse. And so far and they've done this in the past where they've cooperated. They've had where U.S. advisors, and in the Calderon era, U.S. Special Forces embedded with U.S. Marines when they carry out some of these operations, mostly for tactical support. Not that they're in the heat of the firefight. That goes to the Mexicans. But we've always provided we've been providing intelligence and covert support for the operations against the cartels for a long time. The problem is you can't really attack the drug problem by just seizing or destroying drugs. You blow up a drug lab with a drone. Cocaine, for example, comes from coca leaves, which only grow in the Andes region, right? That's why all the cocaine comes out of, Colombia for the most part, but also Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, all have a piece of that. And they've, at one time or another, played a bigger role in the cocaine trafficking business. I mean, Ecuador right now is having a big drug war battle over, increased drug trafficking there, or coming out of that nation. And the same thing is happening on a scale. They've thrown a lot of military at it, and violence has just gotten worse there, if you've been following that. So I guess my point is, that is a big pressure point, because Sheinbaum knows that if the U.S. comes in there and starts doing drone strikes, that's going to it's just going to set the country on fire. And, it's not going to do any favors for how the Mexican populace looks at the U.S. But the bigger fear for Sheinbaum really is the economic threat, that they'll because they really depend on U.S. trade. And that they're our the biggest trading partner, right? And so for the longest time, what's inhibited the drug war and why we should go after the money, which would be more effective, is just how embedded the criminal organizations are in the economy of Mexico. And hence, even in our economy, this drug money has to be laundered. It's 700 billion a year. And how does it get laundered? It gets laundered through our financial systems, because it's got to be made clean, and then it gets invested in whatever, real estate. So, condos in Miami or Vancouver is full of, there's 100 places to invest this kind of money. Yeah, and then resorts in Mexico for that matter. But it all has to get laundered. And there's been, over since I've been covering this year, there's, at least half a dozen banks, including big U.S. banks. Almost all the big U.S. banks have been busted for money laundering, for lax money laundering, outright money laundering. In some cases, they were just, one of the banks, I think it was HSBC, they were shoving boxes full of cash through the teller windows. They knew this stuff was dirty money, but they were making money on it. And so the lax money laundering, let's not look at it too hard. And then they get busted. What happens? No, the bank CEOs who are implicated, nothing. They don't go to jail. They don't even get charged criminally. The banks don't get charged criminally. They get a fine. And then what happens? The fine is probably worth 1/4's profit. So they probably made more on the money laundering than what they paid in the fine. And then the Justice Department will set up a contract with a team, usually former prosecutors, that will kind of oversee the bank for a year or 2 or 3 years. And they get a huge chunk of money. So it's kind of a revolving door. Like, Ashcroft, who used to be our attorney general, was involved in one of these monitoring deals when he came out and was in private practice. And these firms, so it's a racket, So we don't go after the money, but we go after the drugs, and the drugs are as replaceable. Like, you can grow more coca leaves, you can build more labs. It's not a big deal to synthesize a lot of cocaine in the jungle, and just we've tried to find these labs before. We've done, we've sprayed fields of, coca leaves can grow in the middle of the jungle underneath. You wouldn't even know it's there. You wouldn't even know they're coca leaves. I've seen them before. So they had to point it out. So this stuff it's easy to grow, and it's all over that region. And so you can't really blow it up, and as long as there's desperate people that need to make a buck and greedy people that want to make a lot of bucks, this is a very, and their alternative is 30 years of poverty or 5 years of a glorious life with a lot of money, cash, women, guns, whatever. That's the life, right? And that's where the money comes from. And we, have a giant straw sticking down in Mexico, sucking it all up. So there's a lot of there's a lot. It's a multifaceted problem, and there's plenty of blame to go around. If you want to cast blame.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with you there too, and I'm glad you brought up the big banks, because this is just one of those absurd things. We talk a lot about Bitcoin on this show. Bitcoin gets cast in this light as it's used by criminals and money launderers, but it's like actually the real criminals and real money launderers, they use the US dollar and they use the legitimate financial rails. I mean, when we talk about the volume of it,
you're right.
As you said, it's a cost of doing business for them.
I mean, cryptocurrency is another vehicle they use, but they got to get it back into the financial system. I mean, Bitcoin doesn't do any good unless they, can, turn it into something they want to use, right? And Bitcoin you can, but the point is, it's a lot easier, when you have banks that you can launder this money through, and it's very complex. I mean, they have so it's very complicated money laundering operations, and there's money launderers that make a lot of money off this that are outside the banking system but use the banking system. Like with the Sinaloa cartel, they used these money houses where the money was deposited, but then that was money houses that had a relationship with Wachovia, and as you know, Wachovia eventually, not only did they have the problem with the crash, but they also had a big problem with money laundering. And at the time, so when they disappeared, and then I think it was Bank of America bought them up. So Bank of America just bought the whole thing, and did that get rid of the problem? I doubt it. And we know, I could dig up the article. I don't want to name banks without being sure, but there were at least half a dozen big banks. Some of them busted more than once. It's not just Mexican banks, U.S. banks, but they have banks in Mexico. All these major transnational banks, operate in Mexico. So you're right. I would say the bigger problem is in our, what you would call the banking system, the legitimate financial system, because that's where it's got to end up somehow. But, crypto is a new avenue for them. And to be honest with you, it is being used. But to what extent, it's hard to say. It might be they launder the money and then buy the Bitcoin. At what is that really laundering money through Bitcoin, or is it laundering money through banks to buy a safe investment that they can cash in later? Right, it's laundered already. So it's a complicated thing. But we haven't really seriously. There was an operation I think it was in the 1990s, and I cover it was called Operation Casablanca, and they went after the money. They were about to indict a bunch of bankers and some. Frankly, it was starting to get into the Mexican government at a very high level. And at that time, the operation got shut down. And most people believe it was because it was getting too close to compromising the financial system in Mexico, which would have hurt all our investments there and investors here who have, a good, stake in the economy of Mexico. There's no way you can drag the economy of Mexico down completely without really hurting our economy. I mean, Texas is that's their biggest trading partner. It would destroy Texas to lose all that trade. So, but that's Scheinbaum's, to your original question, big fear. She's trying to keep Trump happy so he doesn't do that, just pull an economic move on him, that just completely decimates the binational trading platform that's been set up over the last, 20, 30 years. And at the same time, she doesn't want her own country to explode with riots and revolution, because U.S. forces suddenly are doing drone strikes and accidentally blowing up schools, or whatever happens, because drone strikes are never perfect. So you can see the dilemma she's trying to deal and fight the cartels legitimately that are a threat to the stability of the country and her administration. So I think she's one of the honest ones. There's been presidents of Mexico that are up to their necks in it in the past. And, the pre-party is essentially, which was in power for, 20 or 30, I forget how many years, decades, right? And anytime someone's in power that long, the corruption seeps in and just hangs there. And I think the last couple presidencies, they've all had faults, but I think they legitimately see this as a problem, but don't have the tools to combat it completely, because the legal system, and less than 1% of crimes are prosecuted in Mexico. I mean, murder, you can get people, if you want to get away with murder, you take someone from El Paso, 2 wars, and kill them. you can't be prosecuted in the United States for that. And it's highly likely you won't be prosecuted in Mexico, depending, as long as it's, kind of low profile, right? And that happens, so that could, but that's why you have such a high 200,000 murder. There's no, that many homicides in Mexico would overwhelm our system, our legal system. Definitely their system is, anemic compared to ours, their justice system, right? It's just, it's been eroded over the years too. On the other hand, there's a lot of movement in Mexico for reform, for kind of a rebirth of their democracy. So you have that going on at the same time you have all this other pressure going on. So I wouldn't want to be in her position, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And plus her life and her family's life is in jeopardy, as is a lot of her ministers that she appoints, if they're going to really go after the cartels.
Yeah.
Because what they tell you in Mexico, and the cartel people, he says, if you're not with one of the cartels, you're against all of them, and they're all against you. So you almost got to pick one for protection.
Yikes. That's a scary place to be, especially because, as we mentioned, this story kind of spurned from the fact that they're getting this additional security for the World Cup, which again is happening in June.
Right.
So, Bill, based on what you know about cartel dynamics, security operations in Mexico, do you think the authorities can realistically stabilize this situation? Or could this remain a major concern up and through the tournament? Because I'm thinking you're probably going to see an influx of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. That's also a lot of potential customers for the cartel, right?
One thing that happens, and I blame the media for this, but the conflation of Mideast terrorism, which is political, and cartel violence, which is economic. They don't have a political agenda per se. They just want to make money, right? And in awful ways, but that's what they're about. And it all breaks down. If someone doesn't get paid, that's when the violence breaks out. If someone gets stiffed, or if someone decides, I want all that, all the dope you're moving through the plaza, I want that to be mine. I want people to pay tribute to me for that, and you're in my way. That's when the violence breaks out. I don't think it's I think it's less likely with that big a security presence in Guadalajara during the course of the tournament that you're going to have major violence, but it could break out elsewhere in Mexico. I mean, they're in 27 states, and and that doesn't preclude the fact that you have some hothead, some cartel soldier who loses it and gets in a gunfight in the street. But you have gang violence here too. So I'm not going to say there won't be any violence. With that many people, there's probably going to be drunks that shoot each other. But I think I would be less concerned that the tournament would be interrupted by it in Guadalajara. But I could see violence in other parts of Mexico still. We're only a couple weeks out. It's probably going to break out somewhere. And where that is hard to predict. And that's probably why they're sending all that force there to kind of make sure the violence breaks out somewhere else. And they'd be crazy to do it like that, stage anything there. First of all, because they're outnumbered, they're not going to take on that big a force directly. And also, you're right. There's a lot of money to be made off of that. I mean, they're in a lot of rackets. So mostly when you think about all the violence that broke out, right after El Mencho was killed, there were no U.S. citizens involved, killed or at all. It was all cartel violence, internecine fighting for the most part. And then, they were burning cars and burning storefronts. So it's not like innocent people weren't affected. But generally, when there's killing and violence, it's between cartels and cartel soldiers or people who are involved. People are, and unfortunately, sometimes their families, because that's nasty business. But that doesn't preclude people that are on a street corner and a gunfight breaks out, and bullets don't have names on them. They go they go in a straight line. If you're in the way, you're going to get hit. So there is that to worry about. But again, who knows? It's hard to say. But I would say the tournament is probably, and going to the tournament is probably as safe as it's been before. You were probably living in a bubble if you didn't think there wasn't some risk. And you got to always, I mean, in Chicago, there's some risk, depending what neighborhood you're in, right?
Hey, some of us.
I like Chicago. I'm from that. I'm from the Milwaukee area, and I've been to Chicago. But I'm just saying, what I like. It's can be block by block a little bit, right?
You got to be smart.
Yeah.
Use your brain.
Exactly. Street sense.
And I will say, Bill, I'm really appreciative of your words, because I was like kind of kicking around the idea of maybe going to one of those matches, but now it sounds like because the cartel are strictly like motivated by my money, they're probably going to be thrilled during the thing. There's gonna be so many people buying drugs from them, having a good time. It's probably a boon for them.
I mean, on the street level dealers, maybe, but you remember the cartels are moving tons of stuff, so they're not going to be doing street dealing. But I also think you're right, because if what'll happen to them if they do cause a big incident there will be a huge, especially from the U.S. reaction to it, and that just brings heat on their markets. They don't want heat on their markets. They don't want they already have enough, and that's that, and it's going to come down on them more, and I think that's why the violence starts when you start affecting their markets. They're going to fight for their markets, whether it's against another cartel or against the Mexican military. And they'll also, cut their losses and fight another day. They don't have the fire. They have a lot of firepower, but not the firepower to go up against the U.S. military or even the full force of the Mexican military. But they also have a lot of money to buy off people and get intelligence and have people. They're very good at having, intelligence inside what we're doing. And a lot of that is we run a lot of informants that play both sides of the fence. So we think we're getting the cartel, but they're turning around and helping the cartel and playing us. So there's the drug wars. Yeah, inside it, it's a world. It's a world like you don't know who's on whose side. You just no one knows, and that's why it's so paranoid and dangerous.
Yeah. Well, the good news is it sounds like they're businessmen, and doing something during the World Cup sounds like it would be.
They are
decision,
They are capitalists on steroids. Remember, the only difference between what they do and what let's say bankers do is there's no contracts in the organized crime world or in the cartel world are enforced with bullets. I mean, they don't have courts, they don't have judges, they don't have a way to settle disputes non-violently. They're generally settled violently, and that's why it's so dangerous. But they definitely are hyper. If some of these guys were in charge of corporations, they would be famous corporate CEOs. They're talented, but they put their talents to criminal operations. That's the difference.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you, Bill, we're super happy that you took your talents to here with us at RoxomTV News this morning, because, man, this was a super fun conversation. I think I can speak for both Walker and myself saying we really appreciate your time today. This was super fun. Walker, final thoughts before we let Bill out of here, because this was a fun one.
Yeah, I would just say, Bill, this was fascinating, perhaps a little bit terrifying too. I appreciate you coming on here to join us, and yeah, appreciate the focus as well on one of the key things that facilitates this being that corruption within the banking system. Maybe call it crazy. Some people who facilitate this should start going to jail instead of just paying fines. I don't know. Might be a bridge too far.
I think that would be more effective than playing whack-a-mole with drug seizures. I mean, it gets headlines, it gets law enforcement budgets increase, it further militarizes. It's just like it's an endless cycle of the money would hurt them.
Yeah. Well, Bill, before we let you go, we want to help you. So I'm sure you gained at least a couple of new fans from our viewership this morning. Is there any place I can send them to get more of what you're covering, what you're up to? If you have an X account, where maybe you post your hot takes, we'd love to know.
Yeah, I do have an X account, but I'm more active on other social media platforms because X kind of got, a little polarized and it was hard to get anything through it. But a website, I got a book out, it's called The Great Pretense, and it's about the CIA's role in the drug war in Latin America. And the website is called thegreatpretense.org, O-R-G. And that has links to my other books on the subject. I've done one on Juarez cartel, and different information and stories that I've written and so forth. So I just check that out, thegreatpretense.org. And that's also the name of latest book that I got out. So I suppose I'm promoting that. I am promoting that. I'm not very good at it.
Please promote it.
but yeah, and it's available through Amazon. Check it out. I think if you're interested in this stuff, I think it's good history. It's hidden history. You won't read about it very many other places. And I covered this for a publication called Narco News, which was around for almost 20 years. And that's what we did, and so that's where I've got, where I got my training in the trenches on this stuff. So I had help, I had help because we had a newsroom, but it was quite a ride for 20 years.
Well, Bill, if your book is half as good or half as fun as it is talking to you, I think my mother's got a new Goodreads coming her way in the very near future. So I want to thank you so much for your time today. Right. It was such a blast, and we hope to have you back.
Good talking to you guys. Yeah,
really appreciate
good show.
You. Thank you.
Take care.
Cheers. Cheers. All right, we're taking a quick break here at RoxomTV News, but Walker, America, and I will be back really quick right after this to wrap up our Friday edition here at RoxomTV. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Roxom TV. I'm Walker America. The price of Bitcoin is 73,300 infinitely printable Federal Reserve notes. And speaking of infinitely printable Federal Reserve notes, inflation is reaccelerating as consumer spending stalls. The Fed's preferred inflation gauge just made the worst possible case for anyone hoping rates come down this year. The Bureau of Economic Analysis released the delayed January personal income and outlays report this morning. The numbers: consumer spending rose 0.4%. Personal income rose 0.4%. The headline PCE price index came in at 2.8% year over year, and core PCE, the number the Fed actually watches, jumped to 3.1%, the highest reading in nearly 2 years, up 3% from December. Up from 3% in December. This is January data. It covers a period weeks before a single bomb fell in Iran, before oil went from $65 to $100, before Hormuz closed, before the IEA released 400 million barrels and markets didn't blink. January was supposed to be the calm before the storm, and the calm was already running hot. Now, where the inflation is coming in, where is it hitting us, right? Services are the problem right now. Airline fares rose 2.6%. Physician care jumped 0.8%. Portfolio management fees climbed 1.5%. But these aren't one-off spikes. They're structural stickiness into exactly the categories the Fed has been watching for 2 years, hoping they'd cool. Well, they haven't. Goods inflation is being driven by tariffs, furniture, appliances, capital equipment, all rising. Wholesale margins for professional and commercial equipment surged 14.4% in the companion PPI report, a sign that businesses are passing on import costs directly. The Trump administration rolled back some tariffs on fruit and vegetables, and egg prices crashed 63.9%. But those are the headlines. The underlying trend is goods prices are going up, not down. One piece of good news: rent. Shelter costs rose 0.2%, a deceleration. But shelter is the single largest component of the index, and it moves slowly in both directions. A 1-month dip doesn't reverse 2 years of above target readings. The consumer spending rose 0.4%, the same as December, but the composition shifted. The savings rate jumped from 3.6% to 4.5%. That's the largest 1-month increase in the saving rate since mid-2024. Americans aren't spending more because they feel confident. They're saving more because they don't. Disposable personal income rose 0.9%, boosted by compensation and dividend income. But when you adjust for inflation, real spending growth was essentially flat. Consumers are treading water, earning slightly more, paying more for everything, and setting aside a larger cushion against whatever comes next. Well, what came next was a war. The Fed meets next Wednesday. The 3.1% core PCE makes a rate cut impossible, with the first cut now priced in September. A month ago, traders were pricing in 85% odds of 2 or more rate cuts this year. That's now down to 35%. And that was before the oil shock. March PCE data will capture the first 2 weeks of the war, the Hormuz closure, and the crude spike above $100. It won't be released until April 9th, but the trajectory is clear. Moody's estimates CPI could hit 3.5% by year end if oil stays near $100. Airline fares alone could see 20% inflation on jet fuel. A third of global fertilizer supply transits the Strait of Hormuz. Food prices will follow. The Fed is now facing exactly the same scenario it spent 3 years trying to avoid. Inflation reaccelerating while the economy slows, aka stagflation. February's jobs report shows 92,000 jobs lost. GDP grew just 1.4% in Q4 2025. And now the central bank has to sit on its hands while oil, food, and services prices climb, because cutting rates into an energy shock would pour gasoline onto the fire, pun very much intended. With all this complicated financial jargon, inflation is actually very simple, though. When the money supply increases, the value of the dollar falls. Print more dollars and each one buys less. It's basic economics, or Austrian economics, more likely. More money chasing the same goods means higher prices. Now add war on top of that. Modern warfare burns money at an astonishing speed. A single Tomahawk cruise missile costs roughly $1 to $2 million, meaning every strike literally vaporizes millions of dollars. Sustained military operations can cost billions in a matter of days. None of that spending was in January data, but it will be. The deeper problem is that the United States is already more than $38 trillion in debt. The government does not have the money to fund large wars outright. We can't even balance a budget. It has to borrow or create more currency to cover the gap. When spending expands faster than real economic production, inflation becomes inevitable. The war didn't create that dynamic, it just simply exposes it. As macro analyst Lynn Alden famously put it, nothing stops this train. Inflation becomes a structural feature of the system in this fiscal dominance world. This is why Bitcoin exists, though, to allow individuals to opt out of the inflationary economy entirely. Hank, let's bring you back on here for some final thoughts. Boy, I mean, it just seems like, again, splitting hairs as far as, hey, how much less is your money going to buy on a year-over-year basis? And everybody waiting around like we're waiting for a new pope to be announced when it comes to the Fed. What's the Fed going to do? You know, what color smoke is it going to be? Dovish or hawkish? How are they going to do it? I mean, it all just gets a little absurd. All I'm saying is I'm just very grateful we have Bitcoin to opt out of this.
Free. Okay, we're spending in the last week, I think it was over $11 billion in this new war from a president who campaigned on the promise that we wouldn't be going into any unnecessary wars. Inflation is out of control. Do you know that those Tomahawk missiles, which is exactly the time that blew up that Iraqi school for girls, cost roughly $1 to $2 million per missile? Like, people don't understand how much these wars cost. I don't know if you've ever seen this, Walker, but I've seen these videos where people will have like the guns shooting at like a Gatling gun on a ship, and they'll show you how much money it expends in real time with every bullet. Like, it's crazy. Everything is so expensive. Thank the good Lord Satoshi, we have Bitcoin. Finally, there is a tool that we can combat this excessive spending we've seen from central governments that is killing our ability to maintain and preserve our own wealth. This is a problem. Bitcoin solves this. You and I know this, and hopefully the rest of the world will catch on. Never fast enough, but I'm just glad you and I are here to spread the good word every week, man. It's we're doing God's work, and I stand by that.
Amen. We do the best we can, right? Just and right now there couldn't be a better time. We're pumping a little bit on the day, up around 72,000 right now. But boy, Bitcoin is still on sale. That's all I'm saying.
That's right. I mean, I was talking about in the show yesterday, I'm ready to make Bitcoin sexy again. Maybe I'll make some shirts. I'll send you one. I'm ready to wrap up this week, but next week we got to go back to our job and make sure that everybody knows Bitcoin is the way, the truth, the light, and it helps with this inflation stuff too. So, as always, been a fun Friday with you, Walker.
Likewise, Hank. Have a great weekend.
You too, buddy, and everyone at home. We'll see you next week for more RoxomTV news. Until then, have a nice weekend. Stay safe, stay informed. See you all on Monday.